pen. And speaker, ladies and gentlemen. I am surprised Faris paid $1 million at the sperm to his face. I mean, if you gave him a penny for his thought, you get change. What kind of man would place a value on another man, ladies and gentlemen? He says that if a man sleeps with another woman and runs off, then that man do not have a say.
Yeah, yeah.
But if the man is married, then runs off, then that man has a say. The only yardstick he has over why men should have a say is that marriage certificate. And ladies and gentlemen, we don't think that's a fair yardstick to put. Furthermore, we don't think an evaluation of what kind of father is even fair to begin with, because that's the exact first reason Faris gave you for taking away this right from the mother. He said, on the flip side, what happens if the mother is having abortion just for the heck of it? Ladies and gentlemen, what he necessarily did was place a value judgment upon an individual who would have to bear the physical and psychological burden over having a baby, ladies and gentlemen, independent from the father's psyche being affected whatsoever, being placed in that decision-making process. We think, ladies and gentlemen, also, that had Faris's mother chose to abort him,
it would be a very sad place.
I'm sure. Alright. Faris also proposed building a baby factory, ladies and gentlemen, where a man can go on, have 4 wives, and force every individual wife to keep on having babies. We think all the arguments that came from Faris are arguments for after a couple had a baby. Of course, the emotional bond and stuff starts when the father actually is able to basically see the baby, ladies and gentlemen. Before that, it's all in the mother's womb. How would the man actually know? We will ask the real father.
But you are not only denying the father a role, you are now also denying the woman a role in the marital state. She now can't make a decision either.
Well, she can. That's the point of this debate. Ladies and gentlemen, let's recharacterize this debate really, because this isn't really a debate about, oh, father having a role or not. This is a debate about when the mother do not want to have the baby, and the father says, I want to have the baby, the mother still has to have the baby. Which means that the say is never equal and is always weighted on the male, ladies and gentlemen. So that choice isn't fair to begin with. Sit down, sit down. Secondly, we think it's a form of slavery, ladies and gentlemen. Because the definition of bodily autonomy is that you can do anything you like, ladies and gentlemen, as long as you do not harm anyone else. Now, in this instance, ladies and gentlemen, we don't think a form of emotional harm is quantifiable to an extent to allow this particular right. That's why if I say F off to someone in their face and they're emotionally harmed, they can't really do anything much because they will remain emotionally harmed, and it was always my right to begin with to say this kind of thing. Sit down. And that's the nature of bodily autonomy, ladies and gentlemen. But there is also a secondary degree of consideration within this case, because there's a physical and psychological consideration within pre-birth period, during the birth period, and the post-birth periods, ladies and gentlemen. And the severity of this consequence, ladies and gentlemen, of that individual, the severity of this situations are on that individual that has to go through the entire process. Therefore, the state is only right for the state, ladies and gentlemen, to grant bodily autonomy within a state of freedom, ladies and gentlemen, and not within a patriarchal mindset of slavery, where you unfairly place a particular somebody else's choice within another particular individual. Yes.
Hafiz, let's go back to the first few minutes of your speech where you said a father or a biological father who doesn't want to exist in a marriage should be able to decide whether or not that person or that woman gets a baby. Are you now going to allow fathers who don't want anything to do with the marriage or the woman decide whether or not the woman has the baby?
See, that's the question that I asked you at the beginning of my speech. Why are you placing a particular yardstick upon the value upon the dead? You have, first of all, placed a value upon the dead. Certain kinds of fathers do not have that kind of capability, and then saying that if that marriage certificate is present, then that father suddenly have a right, which shows the exploitative nature of your policy, Faris. I don't get, if you don't get it, sit down. Farish, you look pretty today. Ladies and gentlemen, we have certain societal concerns. Our societal concerns is this definition of freedom. We think every individual should have the choice, especially a woman, ladies and gentlemen, if the consequences of physical and emotional, psychological harm is upon him or herself, ladies and gentlemen. We also feel that if the decision-making process is not fair to begin with, which means that a choice from one party will unfairly place the other party in a state of having to do something beyond her will, ladies and gentlemen, is basically slavery. If the choice, if the responsibility is equal, ladies and gentlemen, then if one party disagrees to it, the contract has to be void, right? It cannot be an agreement of its completeness. On our hand, ladies and gentlemen, we force the man to convince the wife, talk to her, be nice to her, buy her roses, and tell her, ladies and gentlemen, that having a baby isn't such a bad idea. You encourage the sort of discussion to produce a mutual bonding within it. Their proposal, ladies and gentlemen, forces one party against their will to have something that they don't want to begin with. Those kind of harms, ladies and gentlemen, the real practical concerns, and if we look at this world in its real life, it's best, ladies and gentlemen, to have the mother choose. At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, it's not about what if your mother chose not to have you. But in the status quo in which we are in, your mother chose to have you, ladies and gentlemen, through a discussion and an agreement with your dad. And that's what we want, what we have today. Thank you.